Instagram teen accounts have automatic protections for what teens see and who can contact them, plus time management tools. And Instagram will continue adding built-in safety features to help create age-appropriate experiences. Learn more about teen accounts and Instagram's ongoing work to protect teens online at instagram.com/teenaccounts.
Adobe Acrobat, your team's home base. Collaborate within a shared PDF space. You've got your docs, your plans, your specs, and then invite the crew to build what's next. They talk of the teamwork. Here's an updated render. They think that this design could be a contender. And when somebody wonders what's the next step, AI helps you finish the rest. Bolts are tight, now your plan's refined. Run a smoother business when you're all aligned. Do that with Acrobat. Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-Acrobat.
Hey NBN listeners, we're running our 2026 New Books Network audience survey, and we'd love just a few minutes of your time. NBN has been bringing you in-depth conversations with authors and scholars for over 15 years. We haven't done a comprehensive audience survey since 2022, and a lot has changed since then. It's time to hear from you again. Here's why we're asking. We want to understand who's listening, what subjects and podcasts you love most, and where you'd like to see us grow. Your responses help us tell NBN's story to the publishers, libraries, and institutions we partner with. When we can show that our listeners are serious readers, lifelong learners, and heavy library users, it opens doors to new partnerships, better resources, and ultimately a stronger NBN for everyone. And one more thing. If you leave your email address at the end of the survey, you'll be entered to win a $100 gift card to bookshop.org, a chance to stock up on books while supporting independent bookstores at the same time. The survey takes just 5 minutes. Your answers are confidential, and your email will never be shared. Head to newbooksnetwork.com to take the survey today. We really appreciate your support. Now, go take the survey.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Namwali Serpell, award-winning novelist, critic, and a longtime reader and teacher of the works of Toni Morrison, opens her book of criticism, On Morrison, with a word that tends to scare people off: difficulty. But as Serpell moves through the monumental works in Morrison's canon, she makes clear that difficulty isn't a failure of access. It's the condition of Morrison's art. It is at once the thing that makes the novels endure and that which resists easy consumption. What Serpell does, drawing on years in the classroom and a career spent thinking about form, is to reframe that friction as intentional, as Morrison's lifelong engagement with the practice and creation of a Black aesthetics. The question at the heart of On Morrison then becomes not how to simplify Toni Morrison, but how to read her better, how to sit with discomfort, friction, and even negation. On Morrison is what happens when a writer attuned to questions of difficulty, both aesthetic and cultural, turns the lens onto one of the most canonized figures in American literature. Because it is the case that Morrison, in many ways, has been stranded in that canon, mythologized, monumentalized, read for what she represents as much for how the work actually moves. What Serpell insists on, and what reviewers keep returning to in their praise of On Morrison, is her even-handedness in approaching the person and work, her rigorous attention to Morrison's form, to the sentence, to the architecture of the novels themselves, and to the persona that Morrison crafted for herself as a guardian of the greatness of Black literary arts. And what emerges finally is a double encounter. To read On Morrison is to discover Toni Morrison again, to feel the strangeness and precision of the work as if for the first time. But it's also to encounter Namwali Serpell thinking through difficulty as something lived as much as studied. Across the books and in interviews, difficulty becomes a through line in her own practice, as a writer drawn to formal challenge, as a teacher navigating what resists explanation, and as a reader in conversation with one of the greatest American novelists. The result is more than criticism. It's a record of attention, of persistence, of what it means to stay with work that won't resolve, and to find in that refusal not frustration, but meaning. Namwali Serpell was born in Lusaka and lives in New York. Her debut novel, The Old Drift, won the Anisfield-Wolf Book Award, the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction, and the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. Her second novel, The Furrows, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction and was selected as one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of the Year. Her book of essays, Stranger Faces, was a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. She is a recipient of the Windham-Campbell Prize for Fiction, the Caine Prize for African Writing, and a Rona Jaffe Foundation Award. She is a professor of English at Harvard University. And I am lucky enough to be joined by a co-host for this episode. When I heard about Namwali's book On Morrison, I thought immediately of the colleague and friend that I know who is the most engaged and the smartest about Morrison, and that is my colleague at Ithaca College, Derek Adams. Derek is Associate Professor of African American Literature at Ithaca College and happens to be currently teaching an upper-level seminar on Toni Morrison titled Across the Decades: The Challenges the Origins of an Assumed Mythic Status Generally Applied to Her. So I feel so lucky to welcome both of you today to Burn by Books. Thanks so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Namwali, I wonder if we could have you start by reading a little bit from On Morrison, in part because your style is so wonderful and full of energy and engagement in a way that I find that scholarly criticism often loses the delight, the pleasure of that kind of writing. And it's clear you're bringing a novelistic sensibility to this work of criticism. And I think it's important for the audience to hear it. So I'd love for you to start a little bit with it.
Well, thank you so much for those very kind words about my work and for inviting me to read from the book. So I am going to read from the opening, which, as you mentioned, is about difficulty. And the book is called On Morrison. The first chapter is simply called On Difficulty. There are many ways to be difficult in this world. You can be demanding, inconvenient, stubborn, complicated, troublesome, baffling, illegible. Black womanhood is one place where all these forms of difficulty overlap. I have always known this. I have been called difficult more times in my life than I can count. But I only began to understand, to discover the meanings and uses of my own difficulty because of Toni Morrison. Morrison has shaped the way we think about everything, from literature to politics to criticism to ethics to the responsibilities of making art. But the facts remain. She is difficult to read. She is difficult to teach. Notwithstanding the voluminous train of profiles, reviews, and scholarly analysis that she drags behind her, she is difficult to write about. More to the point, she is our only truly canonical Black female writer, and her work is highly complex. This, it seems, is difficult to swallow. The very fact of Morrison, a Black woman and a genius, has been, to some people, simply an affront. In 1979, she was interviewed for two major profiles, one in the New York Times and one in Vogue magazine. At that point in her career, Morrison was the author of 3 novels, her most recent, Song of Solomon, having won the National Book Critics Circle Award for 1977. One might expect an aura of celebration, but the Times profile instead had this oddly truculent tone. She is, at 48, a big, handsome woman with beginning to gray hair. She is often breathless, often running, often, I was to learn, late. Her defensiveness was palpable. I would soon learn that she is a woman of many moods, not just ordinary moods, abrupt, seismic shifts, as if the energy within were caught between opposite poles, the need to express and the need to defend. She will often put on an act. In conversation, she might suddenly, quote, get down and be very chicken and ribs, sucking her teeth, poking a finger into her scalp and scratching, a strange, primitive gesture that makes her hairdo rock back and forth on her scalp like a wig. It's not difficult to get the impression that she's putting you on at times, taking pleasure in watching you trying to figure her out. Putting aside the casual racism of the time and the times, what strikes me is the interviewer's palpable resentment about the myriad ways in which Morrison was difficult, late, defensive, moody, abrupt, performative, quote, strange, quote, primitive, manipulative, implicitly sadistic. What seems to have irked the interviewer most of all was her impression that Morrison actively enjoyed being difficult. In the other profile, in Vogue, Morrison spoke of a white American reader who had, quote, told her how difficult it was to understand Black culture in her books. It was so removed from his experience. She had responded, boy, you must have had a hell of a time with Beowulf. The Vogue interviewer, missing the wit in this retort, went on to comment, quote, Morrison has no patience with people who plead ignorance. But then she does not pride herself on being a patient woman. I find myself being more and more difficult, she says. It's something I really relish. Even Morrison's literary difficulty and the pleasure she took in it was translated here into personal difficulty, a moral failing. How dare she be impatient? Well, wouldn't you be? One reason for Morrison's air of pique was surely the strain of trying to balance the demands of multiple careers simultaneously. She was an editor, a professor, a writer, a critic, and a public intellectual. I have worked in these worlds as well, but not for nearly as long, and rarely at the same time. To bolster my spirits, I often recite her words about how these professions are really all one thing. Quote, I read books, I teach books, I write books, I think about books. It's one job. But extending many branches is sometimes a way of distracting yourself from the exigency of the core vocation. The commitment to writing over all else is often viewed by detractors as selfish. When gender is factored into the equation, the charge can carry the stigma of illegitimacy. Quote, for a woman to say, I am a writer, is difficult, Morrison noted succinctly. She struggled to accommodate these forms of often underpaid literary labor with the unpaid domestic labor of raising 2 sons as a single mother. Quote, it was very difficult writing and rearing children because they deserve all your time, and you don't have it. This occupational difficulty was exacerbated not only by the fact that she was unique in her fields, but also by the fact that she often chose to go it alone. For example, Morrison didn't tell anyone at her first job in trade publishing that she was writing a novel until The Bluest Eye came out at another house. And it's notable that not one of Morrison's sole authored books has an acknowledgments page. While autonomy was indispensable to Morrison's success in her professional life, it was also a source of trouble within it. Her longtime editor, Robert Gottlieb, who was the person who gave her permission to be a writer when she grew up, as she put it, once said, quote, Toni appears to be such a formidable person and is such a formidable person that people assumed that working with her could be difficult. It's exactly the opposite. But his view seems to have been the exception that proves the rule.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful to hear, and I think gives us such a sense of what exactly you were grappling with when you took on one of the great American writers, who happened to be one who was notoriously difficult, but in ways in which I think you explicate as natural and understandable to her existence. But I want to ask Derek to ask the first question to get us started.
Sure, and thank you for that reading. It was quite wonderful. This is maybe just getting to the feeling of necessity and taking this project on. Like what drew you to the project, and more specifically, like Toni Morrison in relation to difficulty?
Sure. So I think multiple factors coincided in my decision to write this book. I, like you, was teaching a class on Toni Morrison, and I had chosen to teach a single author class, which you may know is, a kind of both wonderful opportunity, but also a bit of a challenge, because I wanted to immerse myself in Morrison's work. It felt to me, especially after she passed in 2019, that the hunger that I felt really in my grief was for more of her words. I just wanted more and more of her words. And I wanted also to get a sense of the full trajectory of the career and reread and even read for the first time the works of hers that felt to me to really constitute an entire oeuvre, a whole corpus of a great artist's life. I was also really struck at the time by the current discourse, which Chris alluded to earlier, which perceives literary difficulty or uncertainty or ambiguity, any kind of lack of clarity, as something to be jettisoned. That is something that is somehow not democratic, it's not accessible, it's not a way to reach people and really grab them where they are. And this seemed to me to be a kind of refusal of everything that I had valued in literature as a young person, and especially as a graduate student, where I had chosen to write my dissertation about literary uncertainty. My first academic book is called 7 Modes of Uncertainty. And I was very interested there in what that affords for us aesthetically, in terms of beauty, in terms of ugliness, in terms of what is interesting, but also in terms of how it makes us feel affectively. And most importantly, whether there was something ethical that we could grasp from reading works that are refusing clarity or certainty or fixity. And Morrison really had given me a way into that question, because she was, perhaps of all the writers that I considered in my first academic book, the most articulate about the ethos of literary ambiguity in her work, the aesthetic affordances of it. So she said, I need to have gaps and spaces in my work so the reader can come into it. That this was a form of egalitarianism for her, right? Is that you actually have to co-create the book together. But she also said that she wanted her work to be sophisticated and difficult, demanding and sophisticated like jazz, right? So she also had a sense of the aesthetic affordances of this. And so it was really something that was allowing me to think about how I could resist this almost bullying tendency I'm finding in the culture toward simplicity, toward clarity, toward legibility, all of which seemed to me to really undermine the possibilities that literature can afford.
Yeah, when you referenced just now the sort of critical imperative, it made me think that when Morrison was doing a lot of her writing, there was a different critical imperative at that moment. And I'm thinking specifically of South Asian critics in particular who took on difficulty in their critical and theoretical work as a way of stating that they were no longer acceding to the understood norms of criticism that had come before them. And just saying to the reader, you need to take a step forward towards me, rather than my acceding to your particular needs as a reader. Do you think Morrison was within a moment in that way where creative writers and critics were engaged in a similar project, or does it just happen that she was herself deeply interested in difficulty?
I think it goes back earlier for Morrison. I think it goes back to at least her studies as a master's student at Cornell in the 50s, where she's working with the works of William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf, both of whom were not quite canonical yet. We think of them as obviously part of the canon now, but these are obviously, extremely challenging modernist writers. So I think Morrison's investment came from an even earlier valuing of difficulty, uncertainty, and so on that's coming out of that tradition. It's something that you can see her working out even in her very first book. The Bluest Eye is actually quite an avant-garde book. We often, I think, have this sense reputationally that it's a book for young people about a young girl.
Supposed to be her easy book.
Exactly, and especially because it's her first book, and that we're going to get this story from this young girl who wants to have blue eyes. But actually, it's this very fragmented, modernist, multi-perspectival, multi-narratorial, right? There are parts of it that are in the first person, there are parts of it in the third person. novel. And I think Morrison, there you really see her engaging with ideas that she had started to formulate in her master's thesis. I also think, as her career proceeded and as she became more familiar with African and Caribbean writing, and partly through her work as an editor, she starts really incorporating her Black diasporic aesthetic traditions, which she's picking up from her family growing up in Lorain, Ohio. And she's seeing echoes of it in works by Chinua Achebe and Aimé Césaire. And she's noticing that there's a kind of resonance between the two. And so I think there's also a way in which her development of forms geared toward open-endedness, for example, or multiple views on a certain topic, she starts to trace back to an African tradition. The folk story in Africa she sees as one that opens doors rather than closes them. That at the end of the fable, you don't give the moral of the story, rather you ask the reader, what do you think? And I think she starts to see parallels between that, what she calls village literature, and the modernist tradition that she was so steeped in. So it's an interesting kind of genealogy of how she gets there. I think by the time she's writing something like Playing in the Dark and, really moving toward her high modernist forms like in jazz, I do think there's probably some coordination there with the trends that you're describing in academia as well.
Not sure how to tackle your taxes? Are you sweating the small print? You may be experiencing FOMO, the fear of messing up. The answer? Using TurboTax on Intuit Credit Karma. They help you get your biggest refund, and then we help you do more with it with a personalized plan designed to help you hit your money goals. It's time to take your taxes to the max. Start filing today in the Credit Karma app.
Introducing Home Care Plus, a new subscription service from Lowe's that helps make life easier by giving members a hand with home maintenance. Let Lowe's tackle the tasks you keep meaning to do, like electric dryer vent cleaning, replacing hard-to-reach light bulbs, and more. Subscribe to Home Care Plus for just $99 a year and consider your to-do list done. Members get more at Lowe's. Available in select zip codes only. Cancel anytime. Non-refundable fee. Product purchase required. Terms and service restrictions apply. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I would want to sort of think about this. The examples that you just gave were primarily literary, but you also referenced her being, you referenced the culture being resistant to the ideas of difficulty and leaning more towards simplicity. Do you think about Toni Morrison as, somebody whose work you read, that has personal meaning, you've taught, and then of course write about, as somebody whose difficulty resonates beyond just the world of the literary? I'm thinking of Roxane Gay and her book, Difficult Women, this collection of short stories that shows a variety of ways that women are perceived to be difficult in the world. And if you think about Morrison as difficult in relation to the myriad of ways that it's seen beyond just the literary.
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the moves that I make in my book is that I feel that the attribution of difficulty to her as a Black woman who is, a single mom who's doing all of these things was actually a kind of mistranslation of her commitment to difficulty in a Black aesthetic way. But there's no doubt in my mind that she's also very interested in that exact mistranslation of Black womanhood among her characters, right? Mm-hmm. And so you find, for example, Sula is a wonderful example of someone who really resists interpretation or resists a kind of single, easy to label identity. And the townspeople, in Medallion, in the bottom, the Black community in this fictional town that Morrison creates for the novel, treat Sula like a kind of cryptic puzzle, right? They interpret the birthmark that she has in all these different ways. And they don't really understand how to read her. And they also feel like they can't accept her the way that they did her mother. Hannah, or her grandmother, Eva, both of whom also have their own, challenging personality traits, but somehow had managed to accommodate themselves to the community in a way that Sula really resists. And so Morrison is obviously really fascinated by this personal difficulty, right, in a Black woman. But what I find really interesting is that we always, I think a lot of readers assume that Morrison herself identifies with Sula. But it turns out that she actually felt that Sula and Nell, her best friend, that it's together that they would make the perfect woman, right? That there's somehow two halves of a woman. And in fact, there's a fan letter that I saw Morrison responding to in the archives where she says to someone who'd written to her, I think you like Sula more than I do. And you can tell that there's a little bit actually of fear, right, that Morrison has for this character, and this kind of awe, this kind of admiration. So there's ways in which she's trying to circle the knot of Black womanhood in the work that I think goes back to something that she wrote in 1971 in an op-ed about feminism and about some of the problems with white feminism. She said, one must look very closely at the Black woman herself, a difficult, inevitably doomed proposition. For if anything is true of Black women, it is how consistently they have, deliberately, I suspect, defied classification, right? So the very subject of what she's writing about is something that resists clarity, that resists classifying, right? So I do think that it's not just the form, but also the content of what she's thinking about. That's this kind of intransigent difficulty, this like impossible to undo difficulty. But we try anyway, right?
I want to ask a follow-up to that idea of sort of refusing clarification that is going to prompt Derek to tell a great story about his own encounters with Toni Morrison. And that is that you lay out the ways in which it appears she almost made a third vocation out of refusing clarifications of her work that were offered as either as questions or as theses about her work. She seemed to take a great deal of delight in refusing them on all kinds of grounds, either as directly as, no, I did not intend that, or you have waded into something that is an absence rather than a presence, and you're trying to put your finger on it, and I would prefer you not to. So as to give the sort of second part of that question, I'm hoping Derek will tell the story of when he brought students, I believe through a terrible snowstorm, to see Toni Morrison in Buffalo, and had an encounter that I think will help us determine this a little bit more.
Well, luckily for us, the reading that I took my students to at the Babel Literary Festival in Buffalo was not the snowstorm year. It was the next year with a different author, Jasmine Gale. But yeah, we had been reading, I think at that point we had read Bluest Eye, Beloved, and we're in the middle of reading Jazz. And after the event was done, we got in line to get books signed. And because we were a large group, they asked us to wait at the back, which was fine by us. And we ended up getting to spend about 25 to 30 minutes with Toni Morrison, just chatting with our class. And we had been debating the opening of Jazz, the STH that we see, which of course you wrote about very beautifully in your chapter on Jazz. And several students were trying to make the case that this was actually a reference to Sethe, because we had just finished reading Beloved. And they were adamant that that was the case. And Morrison very gently at that point, but firmly was disabusing them of that notion, saying why do you think that? And kept asking questions to get it out of us, to draw it out of us. And I don't think we had the edition that had the acknowledgments in there, where she, or not the acknowledgments, but the preface in there where she writes about the tisk sound that she's making. But yeah, she eventually was like, think about it in terms of sound, think about it in terms of orality and what opens up for you. And just in talking in that brief moment of time, a student had arrived at the idea of it's like the clicking sound behind your tongue clicking behind your teeth. And she just kind of went, yeah, think about that some more. But led into more conversations for us once we had gotten back about what that might have meant. And I appreciated that she didn't just give it to us, but invited this new way of thinking about opening a novel titled Jazz with sound as opposed to just language specifically. or words specifically.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, it's funny because there is a moment in Beloved where the sound is transcribed the same way. So there is a connection there, but it's Stamp Paid is thinking that he hears that kind of sound when he's outside of 124 Bluestone Road. What's interesting is that sound, which we're describing as a tisk, or I think in old Victorian novels they sometimes say clucking. It's such to me a black sound. That's very much a sound that we associate now with Black queer culture, which comes up a lot in my chapter on shade and on Morrison's use of criticism as a kind of a form of shade. But something I really love about the way that Morrison does it there is that you could push back and say, yes, this is what's important to you, is that you wanted to transcribe that sound, but there are different ways to transcribe that sound. Right. Different writers sometimes put TSK. I've seen STH. I've seen STCH. I've seen people try to get the ch in there more. And you chose one that happens to look quite a lot like this character from the previous novel, who is really, these novels are connected for you in your mind. So it's interesting to me that she was so insistent on, well, it doesn't sound like she refused their reading, but other times you'll find her saying, no, I wasn't thinking of that. And then in a follow-up question, she'll say, but who knows? Maybe deep down I was thinking of that, on a lower frequency, as Ellison would say. Maybe I was thinking of that. And this kind of openness actually to what the reader can bring to the text, I think is something that's really remarkable. She really wanted things to remain open-ended in exactly that way. And she often warned her own students not to take what authors say about their work too seriously. But yeah, I think rather than kind of refusing I would say rather than refusing an interpretation, it's more that she refused a single interpretation.
I love that. Yes, it was. I said disabuse, right? Like she was trying to move them away from the idea that you can only read it as Seppa and in direct connection to this, and figure out why it is that is the reading that you're bringing to this particular moment at the start of her new novel.
Yeah, I mean, in a question that was posed to her in an interview where she actually talks about how a character in Jazz is a kind of beloved, right? Wild.
Wow.
She says a similar thing. So she says, Wild is a kind of beloved. They could be the same. But then at the very end, she says, but I don't want to make all these connections for you. Right. So there's this kind of way in which she's playing with these interpretations when she talks about the identity of beloved, which is one of these interpretive puzzles that I have been really fascinated by for a very long time. She says both of these interpretations are available. Right. So she's very aware that the literary space is one where you don't actually have to decide. And that's precisely what gives it its, I think, power. I often try to explain to students that when you have something that is indeterminate, this is one of the mechanisms by which you perpetuate your immortality as a writer, because people have to reread and they have to go back and they have to reinterpret. If you just give the full story in one go, it's over, then you're kind of like consigning yourself to the dustbins of history, right? So uncertainty and literary, plenitude even, it's one of the reasons we go back to Shakespeare. We still sort of puzzle over, well, what did he actually mean? I just read an article that was arguing about to be or not to be and giving us a new interpretation that isn't actually a suicide speech. And I thought, wow, that's remarkable. But it's the language is so rich that you can actually have another interpretation of it.
Yeah.
Derek, I'm hoping you will ask your question about the Namwali's rather bold claim, I think, about the humor in Morrison.
Well, I mean, it might be worth noting that I just appreciated your humor in the book. That the interspersing of your own thoughts on what people shared. I'm thinking of the moment in the On Monument section where you reflected on somebody eulogizing Morrison and saying, the Song of Solomon seems like it will be a work that lasts. And you're like, Yes, it does indeed. Right.
I was throwing a little shade at Harold Bloom there.
Yeah, I picked up on that.
He needs some shade.
Yeah, Bloom will be fine. But I was thinking about humor as a form of difficulty, right? And you cover this in a variety of different, or across a variety of her texts, a variety of her works. You bring it up in recitative. You really hone in on it in the Song of Solomon chapter. And so I was just thinking about this, the opening to that chapter in particular. You write, quote, "With all that gravitas, you might not realize it, but Toni Morrison is funny as hell," end quote. And then you go on to talk about the function of humor and comedy in her works. And I will just share briefly that I've talked to I don't know how many people about Toni Morrison, because I do adore her as a writer, and she feels very important in my personal life. And I've only ever had one other person who's talked about her works as humorous or funny. Everybody else talks about them as tragic and sad and weighty and all these other things. So I'm just curious to know more from you what you think gets lost when we examine her works without accounting for that humor, right, that she has infused into this. When we don't understand the value of Yo Mama jokes or playing the dozens, what gets lost for us as readers?
I mean, I think, Morrison had a way of thinking about her work that relied on the necessary incompleteness of any reading experience, right? Which is to say, there are various moments where she'll talk about creating a particular aesthetic pattern or palette in part of a novel. And she'll say, but that was just for me. Or she will, for example, in Song of Solomon, give her birth date to a character. And that's clearly just a kind of inside joke for herself, right? And then, but then there are ways that she's speaking to multiple audiences. And, we were talking about Shakespeare before, very famously. He's writing for the Queen, but also for the groundlings, right? There are pieces of the novel that are working at multiple levels for different people. So you could talk about how these pieces of humor are specific. They're sort of like Easter eggs, right? For people who do know what the dozens look like, who do know what signifying is or how shade works. And sometimes, it relies even on pieces of insider information that most readers wouldn't have, even to catch like a pun or to catch some kind of significant word. I'm thinking about like the name Hagar in Song of Solomon, which, is of course a biblical allusion, but also carries with it a little bit of irony because of Aunt Hagar's children, which is one way that Black people refer to themselves. But Hagar, is childless. She basically is a child herself. And so there's an irony that she's playing with there that you're only going to catch if you know that, right? That piece of cultural information. I don't think it, it doesn't mean that you're not getting the book if you don't get everything. I think it's very important actually to understand that all novels work this way. There's always bits and pieces of information that are more shadowed and others that are more in the light, depending on what lens you're coming to the book with. But I think for me, I felt very, I don't want to say frustrated, but I feel like when you have enough people missing something like the humor in, let's say, The Bluest Eye, for example, it means that it builds a particular interpretive aura around a text that doesn't do justice to all that it is trying to do. So the notion that it's a kind of, I call it an identitarian sob story, right? This is the picture that we have of this. It's like, oh, it's so sad to be dark-skinned and not have blue eyes. This is what this book is about. And it's like, actually, this book, especially in its humor, has these moments that are really pushing back against it, that are really ironizing this self-loathing. And I think I just also think it's this kind of remarkable sense of Morrison's wisdom. So when you have Pecola, when you finally have her voice, it's in this really kind of painful split dialogue with herself. But there are all these puns that are happening back and forth between Pecola's inner self and her, her double consciousness, right? And I'm like, Morrison, I think, is showing us there that her tragic view, this thing that has broken this child, is in fact an absurdity, right? When you have humor in a book that is about racial self-loathing, one of the things that you're doing is you're showing the absurdity of that logic. Do you see what I mean? So it's like, this is not an inevitable thing. And it is in fact so absurd that I'm going to show that to you through these moments, which are not just relief. They're not just release from the tragedy. They in fact inflect the tragedy. So I do think you miss some things tonally if you don't pay attention to where the humor is in the books. But I hesitate because I just had a French reader say to me, I just feel like reading your book, I just feel like I'm missing so much because English is my second language, but Black English is a whole other language. And I do think we're losing, as they say, we're losing recipes, we're losing receipts, we're losing a sense of that Black cultural context that Morrison's always riffing on. That makes it harder to read.
I'm thinking of like the potential for meritocratic or more democratized forms of reading if you are engaging on a variety of levels. Like riffing on Black culture becomes a way of democratizing the process of reading for people who have been historically denied that possibility. And humor and understanding things like Playing the Dozens does open up a new or another way of understanding what Morrison is getting at. So I really do appreciate the idea of it's not that you are misreading a text, but there are other things to it that you can get out of this. And it makes me think about recitative, which I've written about in my own dissertation. And the way that you talk about those two characters, their relationship is really one of misreading each other.
Yeah.
And in a sense, also misreading Maggie, who I argue in my class is like the most central character in that story. But it sounds like you're saying that misreading and humor might have a connection. And I'm guessing, does that connection change? Or I'm sort of curious about that connection in relation to the consequences attached to misreading, say, racial codes in a segregated society or in a racist patriarchal society. Whether or not the humor feels different for us because of that context.
I think it does. I think, it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about irony and the uses of irony and the politics of irony. And one of the things that I've been particularly puzzled about and trying to work out is whether irony is in fact neutral politically. And it can be used in different ways politically. And it's really about your attitude about, right, the irony. Recitative in particular, the piece of humor that I talk about is this moment of misunderstanding between the girls about Jimi Hendrix. One of the girls is Black, one of the girls is white. We don't know which is which. And they're in a diner and there are all sorts of people coming in, Black and white. It's this moment in the 70s or I think maybe the late 60s where you have college students of all different kinds of races coming through. And one of the characters is on her way to a Jimi Hendrix concert and the other is the waitress at the diner. And she says, Hendrix, who's she? Something like this, right? And this is how you know that there's a kind of misunderstanding here. But it's also this very interesting moment where the reader is thrown into, well, who is less likely to know who Jimi Hendrix is? Is it the Black working class girl who has never left her small town? Or is it the white working class girl who doesn't know anything about this Black musician, right? So these questions of race and class, and then of course gender is thrown in because Morrison uses this joke, right, about Hendrix being, a name that you can say is a woman's name if you just use it by the last name. Call him by his last name. So I think in that context, it's just funny, right? But it's a kind of humor that opens up all kinds of ironies, right? About Hendrix himself, about music at that time, about racial dynamics, about how class is changing during the civil rights movement. Black students are getting educated in a different kind of way. I mean, it's all there packed into that one single scene. But the stakes of that are very different when you shift later in the story to the question of desegregating a school and people protesting and actually trying to harm each other physically, trying to knock over cars, for example, that hold protesters on the other side. So the stakes of these ironies are this kind of humor, right? And I think there Morrison is really again, riffing on the fact that you actually had a lot of Black parents who were protesting the desegregation of schools because they knew that what would happen is that their, Black communities would no longer have as good an education, right? So there again, that's also playing on an irony because it's playing on like a reversal of our expectations. But the stakes are really different there because people might actually get hurt and people might not actually get an education, as opposed to this person just doesn't know who Hendrix is. You know what I mean? So the stakes of these moments, I think, are really different depending on the context. I think for Morrison, though, there's humor. She has pieces of humor about Setha's propensity to murder whoever comes to the door in Beloved, right? So there's a way in which for her the stakes of humor don't determine whether or not the humor is appropriate, right? What determines I think for Morrison, whether the humor is there is whether it actually makes us think, whether it actually like opens up things that we otherwise might shut down if we view something from too solemn or too straightforward a perspective. So I say this at the end of that chapter on recitative, that I talk about the uses of misreading, right? Misreading isn't just a bad thing. It can also be really productive, which kind of actually invokes Harold Bloom again, because this is how he read the canon. It's also how Henry Louis Gates Jr., my colleague, reads the canon. Right? It's like a series of signifying on the past. I think there's the simplified notion that there's good reading and bad reading, or there's correct reading and misreading. I think Morrison's work just complicates that to a point where what you're actually looking at is the affordances of all of these different forms of reading.
Are your ad campaigns lighting up the dashboard, but not the pipeline? That's bull spend, and marketers are calling it out in Dashboard Confessions.
My boss asked for results, so I opened my dashboard for the only positive-sounding metric I had: impressions.
Cut the bull spend. See revenue, not just reach. LinkedIn delivers the highest return on ad spend of major ad networks. Advertise on LinkedIn. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a $250 credit. Go to linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Beneful. Mornings are when the grind starts. Stretches, immaculate. Cardio, crushed it. Territory, marked. Sorry, geraniums. The dog routine is on point, but it can get a little wolf. That's why I fuel up with high-protein Beneful freshly prepared meals. I'm eating clean with real meat and veggies, served fresh from the pantry. Kick boring in the bowl with Beneful freshly prepared meals. Visit Purina.com/Beneful to shop now.
Where is Daredevil?
I'm right here. Don't miss the return of Marvel Television's Daredevil Born Again.
So what's next?
I feel liberated.
We're gonna take this city back.
Over medicated.
In an all-new season, now streaming only on Disney+.
They're hunting us. It's time we started hunting them.
I can work with that.
This should be tons of fun.
Marvel Television's Daredevil Born Again, now streaming only on Disney+.
Well, and to your point about the varying contextual, like the situations or settings in which we might understand what is humorous and the degree to which Morrison cares, the scene in recitative where they are holding up signs about busing and you don't know whose sign represents what thing, actually ends with Twyla's father-in-law gutting and cleaning fish on one of her signs. So it just sort of seems to be Morrison kind of laughing at the idea that the signs carry all of the significance. Yeah. And relative to a humor that she shares with us, and I think I saw Morrison 5 times over the course of my life. So I believe what I'm about to share happened at Cornell. She had, in the Q&A session, somebody had shared a story which was actually close to something we had talked about before that the interview started, around people purchasing copies of her books to ban them and then burn them. And so somebody had shared this, and I was really intrigued because this had happened in a neighborhood that I was living in high school. And Morrison, and the person had asked, how do you respond to that? And Morrison said, wait, so you're saying they bought my books? And then she just started to laugh under her breath in that way that she did. And it's like, oh, the joke's on them and they don't even realize it. So like for her, I'm just here to sell books. I'm not here to do this. This, whatever you think this political thing is, even though we know that's a sort of tongue-in-cheek response. And it was really humorous. I just find myself laughing at that over and over again. But.
No, I mean, I think the tragic sensibility is an ironic sensibility as well. This is like something Richard Rorty, the American pragmatist philosopher, said. And it's, to me, that's like very much a Black sensibility. It's like when you look at the slave narratives or when you look at the stories in the Conjure Tales, it's like one of my favorites from that Chestnut volume is when a man I think he steals something to eat, and his master is like angry with him, and he's like, "No, I'm nurturing your property," And it's like, it's that sort of thing where I'm just like, it is very much a survival mechanism, but I really do think it's also like an attitude about the world that is it's like very clear on what is real and what is not real, like what is real and what is absurd. And to me, that is, and it's an incredible gift, but it is also a form of wisdom that I think we're starting to lose because we're flooded with misinformation and false information and fake news and all that stuff. So we have this kind of suspicion of fiction and of double meanings, right? But I'm like, actually, that capacity to understand multiple meanings, that kind of ironic sensibility, is far more of a useful tool in our contemporary world than, being literalist about everything.
I wanted to ask you, Namwali, I felt first of all, I'll say that when I was a young junior professor, I found and absolutely loved is it 7 degrees of ambiguity or 7 types?
It's 7 modes of uncertainty. I'm riffing on a book called 7 Types of Ambiguity by William M.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and I love that book, but I felt reading On Morrison that I was also watching a critic discover herself anew as a writer and new openings via which a critic might enter into a text and new voices, and you've used affordances here and just taking more advantage of things available to you. Was that the case? And did you find you were sort of discovering a new critical imperative in yourself as you were writing this?
I mean, it's the two projects came out of very different kind of formal imperatives. The 7 Modes of Uncertainty came out of my dissertation, in which it's a very academic form. It's published with an academic press in 2014. And, that's more than a decade ago. I think in the time between writing that book and writing this book, I got tenure, and that I think was very helpful in terms of feeling freer about the kinds of criticism that I can write. And this isn't with an academic press, it's with a trade press. It's also based on my teaching more than 7 Modes of Uncertainty was, which is very heavily researched. I mean, this is also researched insofar as I have to do research to teach. But there's a way in which the kind of diligent recitation of a literature review, for example, is not something that I feel beholden to. But I've also, in that time, done a lot more writing for public-facing, venues like the New York Review of Books in particular, the New Yorker, the London, not the LRB. I haven't written for them actually. I've written for the New York Times. Just various, ways of trying to translate literary criticism into a mode that can be accessible, as they say. But I think even reading Morrison's own criticism and seeing, for example, the difference between her lecture notes, formal talks that she gave at universities, some of which we have drafts of in the archives, and then something like Playing in the Dark, which was delivered as a series of lectures and then turned into a book. So seeing that she also had this kind of these different registers that she's using, and it was useful for me to see that, because it helped me recognize something that has been happening in my own work for some time. I think mostly, I would say it's less about when we talk about writing for the public as scholars. I think we often say that we're trying to be, I think I just mentioned, be more accessible, be clearer, be easier to understand. I actually think it's more a question of de-jargonizing or defining my terms. I like that we have words for particular literary devices. I think it's important for students to recognize that this thing I'm pointing to in the text as an aesthetic technique has a name because it gets used, and it has, and it's been used for many centuries. A lot of these names are Greek, you know. But
you're also very playful, though. I don't want to lose the fact that
that's what I was going to say is that that the dejargonizing is one thing, but it's like, you know, defining my terms. But I also think and William Empson is a really good example of this. Earlier critics, before the professionalization of the university, were much more interested in themselves writing in a way that's persuasive and compelling, right? They're not just writing dry lecture notes or kind of treatises on aesthetics. They actually are really interested in writing themselves. Some of that is like imitation, right? They're imitating the writers that they're writing about. But I think a lot of it is just about like wanting to be compelling and wanting to be interesting, wanting to be exciting, wanting to pull a reader in. So yeah, I think in some ways it's like it's been a retraining, because I was not taught to write this way as an undergraduate or a graduate student, really. It's through reading other critics but also trying things out differently. I met a graduate student at St. Louis who was saying to me, he's like, every one of your essays, like your openings are so interesting. Like, how do you open an essay? And I was like, I don't know, you tell me. And he said, well, they're always different. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because I'm like trying things out. It's like, I think it's only worth doing if it's fun, you know. And
that's very Morrison of you.
Exactly. I was going to say, yeah.
Absolutely. I know that both Derek and I have a lot more questions for you, but we're sort of running short on time, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't miss a chance to ask you about some books that maybe you've been loving and might want to recommend for the audience.
I mean, I'm reading all the time, and I'm reading in so many different directions all the time, because I'm teaching, for example, 2 creative writing classes right now, but one is on genre fiction and one is on autofiction. And I have them read a lot before they start writing. So I just read, you know, The War of the Worlds, but also like Elif Batuman's The Idiot. So there's a lot of different books that I'm reading currently. But I think what I'd like to do is recommend some novels that I think, you know, there's always a sense, given Morrison's history of what she edited and even just like the kinds of people she did events with and so on. But I feel like one of the things that gets lost, and one of the things that I was trying to talk about in my book, was how experimental a writer she was and how interested she was in experimental writing. And there's a book that I read recently, and that I think is one of the best books by a Black woman that I've read in a long time, that is also like extremely experimental. And that's Maya Biniyam's Hangman, which came out with FSG a few years ago and takes place in an unnamed African country. And I just think it's just extraordinarily exciting work.
I don't know it.
That's pushing the form in ways that I find really fascinating. I mean, this is really interesting. So it's a book that I think the author has gone in a very different direction in their work since, but their first book is a memoir that they said their research about it had in fact invoked and ended up touching on Morrison, which is very interesting. It's a book called Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, and it's about being Ogbanje, which is an Igbo kind of two-spirit philosophy about a single body that is inhabited by multiple beings. Appears in works by Chinua Achebe as well, so it's just something that's very well known in the Nigerian literary tradition. But Akwaeke's work, I think, is really fascinating, and I just feel like, again, what they do experimentally with narration and form in that book would have really fascinated Morrison. So those are two young Black writers who I feel like we don't know enough about and that I think Morrison would have really enjoyed.
Those are great suggestions that I'm definitely going to take you up on. And I just want to encourage my listeners to go out to their independent bookstore and get On Morrison by Namwali Serpell. This has been such a pleasure to get to talk to you about it. It's made me want to run out and reread all of Morrison and also to take Derek's class. But it's also really lit something in me in the way in which you're refusing and see Morrison refusing a kind of necessity of absolute clarity and clarification. And I so appreciated it and really delighted in reading this in a way that I haven't about criticism in some time. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for your questions and your beautiful introduction to the book. I found it very precise, very resonant with what I was doing. And it's a rare gift to be able to do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Derek, I knew you would be the perfect interlocutor, but thank you much, Derek.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate being here.
Thanks so much, Derek.
Well, that's all for me for now. My thanks to Namwali Serpell for coming on to talk about her extraordinary take on the life and work of Toni Morrison, On Morrison. And likewise, my great thanks to my esteemed colleague and friend, Derek Adams, for being the Morrison expert on the hosting side. You continue to be a genius in all things, Professor Adams. You can find links to purchase On Morrison and all of Namwali's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or now YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.